January 17th, 1943. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The jungle breathed with heat. Thick vines strangled the mahogany trees, and the air hung so heavy with moisture that even standing still felt like drowning. Beneath a canopy that filtered sunlight into dim green twilight, a young Japanese soldier named Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto sat with his back against a fallen log, his uniform in tatters, his rifle long abandoned, his eyes sunken deep into a face that had become a mask of bone and shadow, watched as two American Marines approached through the undergrowth. He did not rise. He could not rise. His legs, swollen with beriberi and wasted by months of starvation, would no longer obey him. The Americans carried their weapons casually, almost carelessly, and when they saw him, they did not shoot. Instead, one of them reached into his pack and produced something Yamamoto had not seen in 7 months. A can of meat, not dried fish, not moldy rice. Meat, sealed in metal, preserved and abundant. The Marine opened it with a small blade attached to his belt. The sound of the can opener cutting through tin, somehow louder than the distant artillery. He handed it to Yamamoto without ceremony, without triumph, and walked away. Yamamoto stared at the can. Inside, pink processed ham glistened with its own juice. The smell made his stomach clench with a pain he had almost forgotten was possible. He had been taught that Americans were soft, decadent, spiritually weak. He had been told they would crumble under the Bushido spirit, that their love of comfort would make them cowards. But the man who had just given him food looked neither soft nor weak. He looked fed. He looked strong. And as Yamamoto brought the first piece of meat to his cracked lips, tasting salt and fat and something impossibly rich, a crack appeared in everything he had believed about the war, about his enemy, and about the empire he had been willing to die for. The Pacific War was not supposed to unfold this way. When Japanese forces swept across Asia in late 1941 and early 1942, they moved with a speed and ferocity that stunned the world. Hong Kong fell in 18 days. Singapore, the great British fortress, surrendered in 70. The Philippines, Wake Island, Guam, all collapsed before the momentum of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. The soldiers who carried out these conquests had been forged in a culture that worshipped sacrifice, that elevated suffering to a spiritual virtue, and that promised glory through death. They were told that the Western powers, particularly the Americans, were morally corrupt, obsessed with material pleasure, incapable of enduring hardship. Japanese military training emphasized austerity. Soldiers were expected to survive on minimal rations, to endure pain without complaint, to view hunger not as a weakness but as a test of spirit. Officers received better food than enlisted men, but even their portions were meager by Western standards. A typical Japanese soldier in the field subsisted on rice, pickled vegetables, dried fish, and occasionally tinned meat or biscuits that were reserved for special operations. Daily caloric intake often hovered around 1,500 calories, sometimes less, especially as supply lines stretched and fractured across the vast Pacific. The ideology underpinning this deprivation was deeply embedded in Bushido, the way of the warrior, which taught that physical comfort weakened the soul, that luxury eroded discipline, and that a true soldier should be indifferent to bodily needs. This was not merely propaganda. It was doctrine, drilled into every recruit from his first day of training. The Japanese military genuinely believed that their spiritual superiority, their willingness to endure suffering, would compensate for any material disadvantage. But material disadvantage was precisely what they faced. The United States entered the Pacific War with an industrial base that dwarfed Japan's. American factories produced not only weapons and ammunition, but food, vast quantities of it, processed and packaged for efficiency and preservation. The U.S. military logistics system was designed around the principle that a well-fed soldier was a more effective soldier, that nutrition directly impacted morale, physical performance, and mental resilience. By 1943, the standard daily ration for an American serviceman in the Pacific exceeded 3,000 calories. The C ration, developed specifically for field use, contained canned meat, biscuits, sugar, instant coffee, and cigarettes. The K ration, lighter and more portable, still provided chocolate bars, tinned cheese, processed sausage, and fruit bars. Beyond these, supply ships brought fresh beef, eggs, bread, butter, canned vegetables, canned fruit, ice cream when possible, and luxuries like Coca-Cola. This was not extravagance. It was calculated policy. The American military understood that soldiers far from home, fighting in brutal conditions, needed not only sustenance, but a psychological connection to the civilization they were defending. Food was that connection. A hot meal, a chocolate bar, a cold soda, these were tangible reminders that the United States possessed not only the will to fight, but the capacity to care for its men, to project power, not just through firepower, but through sheer abundance. Japanese soldiers, when they first encountered American positions overrun or abandoned, found this abundance almost incomprehensible. Reports filtered back from battlefields across the Pacific describing enemy supply dumps filled with food, some of it already opened and discarded, waste on a scale that seemed obscene. At Guadalcanal, Japanese forces recaptured areas the Americans had briefly held and discovered crates of canned peaches, condensed milk, coffee, and chocolate. Soldiers who had been eating handfuls of rice and seaweed stared at these treasures, unable to reconcile what they saw with what they had been told. How could an enemy so wasteful, so indulgent be winning? The cognitive dissonance was profound. Some dismissed it as proof of American decadence, evidence that their enemy lacked the discipline to ration properly. But others, especially as the war dragged on and Japanese logistics collapsed, began to see it differently. This was not waste. This was power. A nation that could afford to throw away food was a nation with resources beyond imagination, and a soldier who ate well was a soldier who could fight harder, march longer, and think more clearly than a man starving in the mud. The transformation in perception accelerated as Japanese soldiers began to be taken prisoner in significant numbers. For the first 2 years of the war, surrender was almost unthinkable. Bushido code dictated that capture was the ultimate dishonor, worse than death. Soldiers were expected to fight until killed, or to commit suicide, rather than fall into enemy hands. Many did. But as the war turned against Japan, as entire garrisons were cut off and starved, as malaria, dysentery, and beriberi ravaged units already weakened by hunger, more and more men found themselves too sick, too weak, or too isolated to continue fighting. Some were found unconscious. Others staggered out of the jungle, half dead, seeking only water and an end to pain. These men, when they became prisoners of war, entered a world that shattered every assumption they had carried into battle. They expected torture, execution, or at best brutal captivity, mirroring the treatment Japan inflicted on Allied prisoners. What they received instead was medical care, shelter, and food, astonishing quantities of food. The American military, adhering to Geneva Convention standards and motivated by a combination of legal obligation, strategic propaganda value, and genuine humanitarian impulse, fed its prisoners. According to the same basic standards, it fed its own troops. POWs received 3 meals a day. Hot meals. Meals with meat, vegetables, bread, and fruit. Meals that, in both quantity and quality, exceeded anything most of them had eaten even before the war, let alone during it. The initial reaction was disbelief. Many prisoners, too malnourished to process rich food, became physically ill after their first American meal. Their shrunken stomachs rebelled against the sudden intake of protein and fat. Medical officers had to carefully manage the refeeding process, starting with rice porridge and gradually introducing more substantial fare. But even the porridge was prepared with care, seasoned, served warm, accompanied by tea or juice. As the prisoners recovered, as their strength returned and their minds cleared from the fog of starvation, they began to observe. They watched American guards eat the same food they were given, sometimes from the same kitchen. They saw enlisted men, ordinary soldiers, no different in rank from themselves, sitting down to meals that would have been lavish by Japanese officer standards. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, gravy, green beans, white bread with butter, apple pie, coffee with sugar, and condensed milk. These were not special occasions. This was routine, daily, expected, and the Americans, incredibly, sometimes complained about it. Complained that the beef was tough, that the coffee was weak, that they were tired of the same menu. This casual ingratitude, this assumption of abundance, was perhaps more shocking than the abundance itself. It revealed a baseline standard of living, a societal expectation, so far beyond Japanese experience that it seemed almost alien. One prisoner, a former infantry lieutenant named Hiroshi Nakamura, later wrote in his post-war memoir about the moment he understood the true scale of the disparity. He had been captured on Saipan in July 1944, wounded and delirious, found by a Navy corpsman who bandaged his injuries and carried him to an aid station. After surgery and 2 weeks of recovery, Nakamura was transferred to a POW camp on Hawaii. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by armed sentries. But inside the conditions were almost surreal. Barracks were wooden, raised off the ground, with screened windows and electric lights. Latrines were clean, regularly disinfected. There was a small hospital with actual doctors, actual medicine, and the mess hall served food 3 times a day on metal trays divided into sections for different items. Nakamura, who had not eaten a full meal in months, could hardly process the first dinner placed before him. Pork chop, rice, cooked carrots, a slice of bread, canned peaches in syrup, and a cup of coffee. He ate slowly, mechanically, his body responding to nutrition with something close to euphoria. But it was later, watching the American soldiers who ran the camp, that the revelation struck him. He saw a sergeant sit down at an adjacent table with a nearly identical meal. The sergeant ate quickly, without ceremony, then went back for seconds. Seconds. There was more food than he needed, and he could simply take it. Nakamura asked another prisoner, a man who spoke some English, if this was a special day. The other prisoner laughed bitterly. "Every day," he said. "For them, every day is like this." The symbolic weight of food in the Pacific War cannot be overstated. It became a measure of national strength, a visible, tangible proof of which side possessed greater industrial capacity, better logistics, more secure supply lines, and ultimately, a more sustainable model of warfare. Japanese soldiers, as they starved on isolated islands, came to refer to the Pacific Campaign as the Logistics War. They understood, too late, that battles were not won by courage alone, that spiritual fortitude could not compensate for empty stomachs and broken supply chains. American forces, by contrast, moved through the Pacific on a tide of material support, so vast that it seemed almost magical. Every amphibious assault was preceded by supply ships, cargo planes, and floating depots that ensured troops ashore would never lack ammunition, medicine, or food. Even on remote atolls, even in the most forward positions, American soldiers received regular mail, packages from home, and rations that included small luxuries like cigarettes and chewing gum. These items, seemingly trivial, had profound psychological impact. They reminded soldiers that they were connected to a vast, functioning, productive society that had not forgotten them. They reinforced the idea that the United States fought not from desperation, but from surplus, that it could afford to project power across the world's largest ocean and still maintain a standard of living higher than most nations achieved in peacetime. For Japanese POWs, this realization was devastating and transformative. Many had been indoctrinated since childhood to believe in Japan's divine mission, in the superiority of its culture, in the righteousness of its imperial expansion. The war, they were told, was a struggle against Western colonialism, a fight to liberate Asia from white domination. But how could a liberating power, allow its soldiers to starve while the colonizers feasted? How could a superior civilization fail to feed its own men? The contradiction gnawed at them, eroding the foundations of their belief. Some prisoners became deeply depressed, seeing the war as lost, not just militarily, but morally. Others grew angry, feeling betrayed by leaders who had sent them to fight without adequate support. And a few, a small but significant number, began to question the entire ideological structure of the Japanese state, to wonder if democracy, for all its supposed weaknesses, might actually produce better outcomes for ordinary people than military dictatorship. This intellectual and emotional shift was exactly what American psychological warfare officers hoped to encourage. The United States, recognizing the propaganda value of well-treated prisoners, produced films and pamphlets featuring Japanese POWs eating, recovering, even smiling. These materials were distributed in combat zones, dropped from aircraft over Japanese positions, designed to convince starving soldiers that surrender was not only survivable, but preferable to pointless death. The strategy had mixed success. Japanese resistance remained fanatical in many battles, but as the war ground on and conditions worsened, the trickle of surrenders increased, and each man who surrendered and survived carried with him a story that, when the war ended, would circulate through a defeated nation struggling to understand how it had lost. The contrast between Japanese and American food culture extended beyond military logistics into deeper questions of social organization and values. Japan's traditional diet, based on rice, fish, vegetables, and soy products, was nutritionally adequate but monotonous and low in calories by Western standards. Meat was historically scarce, a luxury rather than a staple. Portions were small, meals simple, eating itself viewed more as fuel than as pleasure. This reflected a broader cultural emphasis on frugality, self-discipline, and communal obligation over individual satisfaction. The military intensified these values to the extreme, creating a system where suffering was glorified and comfort despised. American food culture, by contrast, was rooted in abundance. The United States, with its vast agricultural lands and immigrant traditions, had developed a cuisine that celebrated variety, generosity, and the pleasure of eating. Meals were social events. Portions were large. Waste, while not encouraged, was tolerated because there was always more. This was not merely a matter of wealth. It reflected a different philosophy of human life, one that prioritized individual well-being, that believed people should enjoy their existence, that saw happiness not as a distraction from duty but as a foundation for it. When Japanese prisoners encountered this philosophy in the form of American rations, they encountered a different vision of what society could be. Not perfect, certainly. The United States had its own profound contradictions, its racial segregation, its economic inequalities. But in the specific context of military provisioning, of how a nation treated the men it sent to war, the American system appeared overwhelmingly superior. And food, simple food, became the medium through which that superiority was communicated. One of the most poignant documented accounts comes from a group of Japanese soldiers captured on Iwo Jima in March 1945. The battle for that island was among the most brutal of the war. A 36-day meat grinder that killed nearly 7,000 Americans and all but a handful of the 21,000 Japanese defenders. Most Japanese soldiers fought to the death, but a few dozen, trapped in caves and out of ammunition, were taken prisoner. One of them, a 19-year-old private named Kenji Sato, later described his first meal as a POW. He had not eaten in 4 days. The cave system where he had been hiding had no food, no water, only the bodies of his comrades and the smell of sulfur and death. When Marines finally stormed the cave, Sato was too weak to resist. They carried him out into blinding sunlight, gave him water, and took him to a field hospital. There, still dazed, he was given a tray of food: scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, orange juice, and coffee. He stared at it, unable to comprehend. Eggs, fresh eggs, Not powdered or preserved, but actual eggs cooked soft and yellow. He had not tasted eggs in over a year. Bacon, crispy and fragrant with a smell that made his mouth flood with saliva. Bread, soft white bread, still warm, spread with butter that melted into the surface. And orange juice, cold and sweet and impossibly refreshing. He ate slowly, afraid he might vomit, and tears running down his face. Not from sadness, not from relief, but from a kind of existential shock. He had been prepared to die for his emperor. He had believed that dying was honorable, necessary, meaningful. But now, tasting this food, feeling his body respond with desperate gratitude, he realized that he wanted to live. That living felt better than honor. That this American breakfast was more real, more true than any ideology. The symbolism of eggs, specifically, recurs throughout prisoner accounts. Eggs represented freshness, perishability. A supply chain so efficient that fragile items could reach frontline troops. They were also deeply associated with home, with normalcy, with the kind of meal a mother might cook. For soldiers from both sides, eggs carried emotional weight beyond their nutritional content. But for Japanese prisoners, who had subsisted on dried rations and foraged plants, eggs were almost miraculous. The fact that the Americans could provide them routinely, even in forward areas, even after months of combat, demonstrated a logistical capability that defied understanding. Some prisoners convinced themselves that the food must be reserved for propaganda purposes, that ordinary American soldiers could not possibly eat this well. But interaction with guards quickly dispelled that notion. The guards ate the same food. They threw away half-eaten portions. They traded cigarettes for candy bars from each other. Casual transactions that revealed an economy of surplus. One prisoner, trying to make sense of it, asked a guard through a translator if America had won a great victory recently, if this was celebration food. The guard looked confused. "No," he said, "this is just regular chow." Regular. The word haunted the prisoner. In Japan, such a meal would be extraordinary. Here, it was beneath notice. As the war moved into its final year, the disparity grew even more stark. Japan's merchant fleet had been decimated by American submarines. Supply routes to isolated garrisons were cut. Soldiers on bypassed islands starved slowly, eating grass, roots, insects, sometimes each other. Meanwhile, American forces prepared for the invasion of Japan itself, stockpiling supplies on a scale never before attempted. The logistics plan for Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion, called for accumulating millions of tons of food, ammunition, and equipment in the Marianas and Okinawa. The invasion never happened, rendered unnecessary by Japan's surrender in August 1945. But the supplies remained, a monument to American production capacity. When occupation forces entered Japan, they brought with them not only tanks and troops, but food, vast shipments of grain, canned goods, and powdered milk intended to prevent mass starvation among the Japanese civilian population. The country, after years of war rationing and then devastation from firebombing, was on the brink of famine. American relief efforts, coordinated through the occupation government, provided millions of Japanese with their first adequate meal in months or years. This, too, was propaganda. But propaganda of a particularly effective kind. It demonstrated that the United States, having defeated Japan utterly, was willing and able to feed its former enemy. The message was clear. American power was not merely destructive, it was generative. It could produce, distribute, and sustain on a scale that Japan's militarist government never could. The psychological impact of this experience on the generation of Japanese who lived through it cannot be overstated. For soldiers who became prisoners, for civilians who received occupation rations, for anyone who directly encountered American material abundance, the experience forced a re-evaluation of pre-war assumptions. If Japan's leaders had lied about American weakness, what else had they lied about? If democracy could produce such prosperity, could feed its people and its soldiers so well, then perhaps Democracy was not decadent but effective. Perhaps individual rights and economic freedom were not weaknesses but strengths. These questions, percolating through Japanese society in the late 1940s and early 1950s, contributed to Japan's post-war transformation. The new constitution, imposed by occupation authorities but embraced by many Japanese, rejected militarism and enshrined civil liberties. The economic system, rebuilt with American assistance, prioritized industrial production and rising living standards. Within 2 decades, Japan would become one of the world's wealthiest nations, its citizens among the best fed. This was not a direct result of wartime food experiences, of course. Many factors drove Japan's post-war miracle. But the memory of starvation, the visceral understanding of what material deprivation meant, created a national consensus around the importance of economic development and stable food supply. Never again would Japan go hungry. Never again would its people be asked to embrace poverty as virtue. For the United States, the war reinforced existing beliefs about the relationship between prosperity and power. American leaders concluded that military strength required economic strength, that a wealthy society could sustain conflicts that would break poorer ones. The post-war order they constructed, with its emphasis on free trade, economic aid, and institutional cooperation, reflected this logic. Food aid became a key instrument of American foreign policy, used to win allies, stabilize governments, and demonstrate ideological superiority over Soviet communism. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe, and the Food for Peace program, which distributed American agricultural surplus globally, were both descendants of the wartime understanding that logistics mattered, that feeding people was a form of power projection, and always the memory of well-fed GIs and starving Japanese soldiers served as an object lesson in why the American model had prevailed. It was not just that the United States had more guns or better ships. It was that the United States could support those guns and ships with an economy so productive, so efficient, that soldiers in the most remote jungles could eat steak while their enemies gnawed tree bark. The epilogue to this story is not simple triumph. War is never simple. Thousands of American servicemen died in the Pacific, many of them young men who never tasted another Thanksgiving dinner or birthday cake. Japanese soldiers who survived starvation and captivity returned home to a nation in ruins, their sacrifices rendered meaningless by defeat. Civilians on both sides suffered losses that no amount of food could compensate. But within the larger tragedy, the specific question of food and logistics offers a clear lesson about what enables nations to wage war successfully and what happens when ideology collides with material reality. The Japanese military's belief that spirit could overcome scarcity was not merely wrong, it was lethal. It killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers, not through enemy action, but through starvation, disease, and the breakdown of supply systems that were inadequate from the start. The American military's investment in logistics, in feeding its soldiers well, was not mere luxury. It was strategic wisdom. A soldier who eats well fights better, resists disease better, maintains morale better, and survives to apply lessons learned. These are not abstract principles. They were proven in thousands of small moments. A can of ham opened in a jungle, a hot breakfast on a volcanic island, a prisoner's tears at the taste of eggs. Each moment represented a choice, a societal decision about what mattered, about whether human life deserved comfort or only demanded sacrifice. The symbol of food, then, transcends the Pacific War. It becomes a measure of civilization itself, of whether a society organizes itself to maximize the well-being of its people or to extract their labor and lives for abstract goals. Japanese militarism, for all its rhetoric about honor and glory, was a system that ground its own population into dust, that demanded everything and provided almost nothing, that mistook cruelty for strength. American democracy, for all its flaws, was a system that believed prosperity mattered, that citizens and soldiers deserved not just survival, but a decent life, that the purpose of power was not merely to dominate, but to protect and enrich those who granted it. This is not to say that the United States always lived up to these ideals. Its treatment of racial minorities, its economic inequalities, its capacity for violence, all complicate any simple narrative of virtue. But in the specific context of the Pacific War, in the question of how to sustain armies across vast distances, the American approach was demonstrably superior, and that superiority was communicated most effectively not through speeches or propaganda posters, but through something as basic and profound as a meal that said, "You matter. Your life has value. You are worth feeding well." This message, delivered to American soldiers and eventually to Japanese prisoners, was the quiet ideological foundation of victory. Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto, sitting in that jungle with a can of ham in his hands, did not think in these grand terms. He thought about the taste of meat, about the Americans who had given it to him without hatred or contempt, about the officers who had told him Americans were weak and how wrong they had been. He thought about his mother, back in Hiroshima, and whether she was still alive, and whether he would ever see her again. He thought about the Emperor, whose divine mission now seemed more distant and hollow than it ever had. And as he finished eating, as he felt strength returning to his limbs, he thought about survival, about choosing life over honor, existence over ideology. The war would end. He would go home, or to a prison camp, or perhaps die still. But in this moment, with the taste of salt and fat still on his tongue, he understood that he had been lied to, not about tactics or strategy, but about something more fundamental, about what mattered, about what was real, about what gave life meaning. The Americans had food because they had built a society that produced food. They were winning because they had organized themselves to win, not through slogans, but through farms and factories and ships and an economic system that rewarded efficiency. And Japan was losing because it had organized itself around an idea of sacrifice that sounded noble, but was in practice simply starvation dressed in poetry. Decades later, survivors of the Pacific War would gather for reunions and memorial services. Japanese veterans and American veterans, old men now, would sometimes meet and share meals. The conversations were awkward, translation difficult, memories painful, but they would eat together, and in that eating, there was a kind of communion, a shared acknowledgement of what they had endured. The Americans would remember heat and fear and friends lost. The Japanese would remember hunger and defeat and the bitter lesson of inadequacy. But they would also remember the moment when an enemy had shown mercy, when food had crossed the line between victor and vanquished, when full bellies had made possible something that empty ones never could: the recognition of common humanity. This, perhaps, is the deepest truth of the story. War divides, hunger isolates, and ideology blinds. But food, in its material reality, in its requirement that we eat or die, connects us to basic truths. It tells us that the body matters, that survival is not shameful, that life itself has value beyond abstract causes. The Japanese soldiers who surrendered and were fed learned this truth the hard way. They learned that their government had been willing to let them starve for nothing, while their enemy, the supposed decadent Americans, would feed even prisoners, because feeding them was the right thing to do, the practical thing, the human thing. And so, the story of Japanese POWs stunned by American rations is not merely a historical curiosity about logistics and cultural difference. It is a story about what societies choose to value, about how those choices play out in moments of crisis, and about the price of believing in systems that demand suffering as proof of virtue. It is a story about cans of ham and plates of eggs, about the quiet power of abundance, about the way material reality can shatter ideology when the two collide. It is a story that begins in a jungle with a starving man and a can opener, and ends with the understanding that how a nation treats its soldiers, how it feeds them, how it values their lives, reveals more about that nation's true character than any proclamation or propaganda. In the end, the meal was the message, and the message was that some wars are won, not because one side is more willing to die, but because it is better organized to live.